Night had descended on the governor's mansion in Shishan City. Two men stood near a table piled with food. One commented that even for a wedding feast this was too lavish, especially during a time when supplies were scarce, while the other noted that this was, after all, an arranged union between the governor and the biggest financial group in Shishan, the Uni Financial Group. Then, the other man mentioned that this was the first time a human and a monster had wed, so as a sign of peace it was expected that the celebration would be much grander than usual. The balding man grabbed a pastry and asked if his friend wanted to eat. But the man only glanced at the child behind him and said he had no hunger, adding that he didn't understand what the special forces were doing to let a small beggar sneak into the gathering hall, and now the poverty he showed left a bitter taste in his mouth. A boy walked up to the maids and asked for a slice of blueberry pie for his little sister's birthday. The women glared at him with annoyance and told him to leave, as this was no place for such a filthy child to be roaming. A large shadow loomed over them. A huge one-eyed creature opened its jaws and asked if they had just said there was no more blueberry pie. The brunette's eyes widened in terror and she tried to respond. The boy was hoisted by the collar as the creature said it was just using him as a temporary snack before its meal. The creature tossed the child into its mouth. The woman turned white as blood sprayed on her and whispered that they still had blueberry pie. Thick red fluid dripped onto the floor. Suddenly a stone flew at the creature's head. The little girl swung her arm and demanded her brother be returned. The men turned around in fear and ran to avoid being caught between the child and the creature. The villain leaned over to the little girl, showing his teeth, and said her brother tasted delicious. She cried through gritted teeth, and the other man added that she would also make a tasty snack. Everything in the golden hall gleamed, and music played. The man bowed with a grin, turning to the governor, and said that thanks to him they reached an agreement on a truce, calming the fires of conflict between monsters and humans, and the Shishan region was fully ready for repair and rebuilding, and the quality of life for regular people also quickly started to return to its pre-war level, and they looked forward to the bright future ahead, then added that their Jinsure financial group would also like to provide some aid in restoring the city. There was a creature in a suit sitting on the throne and a woman in a white gown on his lap, and he replied to President Jin that he had already so naturally given support to their forces that he would not forget such a contribution. So, he offered him the role of president of the Shishan Reserve Bank, in addition to a seat on the board of the Chinese trading group, to which the other person gladly accepted and thanked him for his generous act of kindness. The two men watched them from the side, discussing that this would make anyone jealous. After all, President Jin had truly achieved great success by gaining these two profitable positions. But his companion argued that it was nothing special compared to the successes of the Uni Financial Group, and that clever fox Yuan Jinyuan had already relied on the help of creatures from the very start, controlling about half of the properties in the entire Shishan region, and now even his beloved daughter was willing to marry the governor so their prospects would be endless. After which, the man pointed out that the bride looked small compared to the scary build of the groom. So, it was as if no one was harmed on this fortunate day. Someone clapped their hands calling for quiet. The woman came down the stairs and suggested they proceed with the plan, since all the important guests were already here, and asked the hunters to block all the exits and not let anyone leave, because the leader of the rebel army was among them, and they would be able to quickly capture him, and everything would be over in a moment. The people looked at Yanja with irritation and asked what this meant and why they were planning to use them as bait, especially since they did not want to stay in the same place with the rebel army members, because it was too risky. The warriors shut the gate and asked them to stay calm, because everything was going as the lady had planned, and they would ensure the safety of all the guests present today. Suddenly the door was broken down, and pieces of a large body flew into the hall. The guests raised their heads in fear as blood poured down on them. The eye of the one-eyed creature was covered with a bloody mist, and the voice said it wanted to give everyone a small present to celebrate the governor's wedding. The hero smirked as he held the part of the dead creature and asked if he had arrived at a bad time. Everyone rushed to the exit, shouting that there was a man who dared to do such a thing on the grand day of the governor's wedding, and no one here could clearly ensure their safety. The woman stepped forward, recognizing the wanted A-rank criminal. She grinned and said she had been busy handling the rebel army forces recently, and she didn't want to personally deal with a minor figure of his level, but he had shown up at the perfect time, so she could use the guy as the first gift for the groom. The girl waved her hand and said she had just sent hunters to the martial arts center that had taken him in, and their original goal was to use the center as bait to lure him out. But since they hadn't found the hero there, everyone he knew had probably already been completely destroyed. The brunette raised an eyebrow and replied that, if they had already gone through his training, but were still killed by the trash that had been sent, then they themselves were trash and deserved to die. The other woman's eyes flashed, and she admitted she didn't like stubborn men like him, since it usually meant it was a complex about another part of the body that wasn't usually firm enough. She pointed forward, and at her command, several people rushed to catch him. The guy raised his hand when armed foes approached him and noted that this was admirable loyalty. He slashed the enemies with his fingers in a few precise moves and, with a flash of his eyes, added that it was a shame they couldn't grasp the difference in strength. There were bodies lying around him, and the woman mentally tried to figure out how one S-rank hunter and 3A rank hunters were defeated in an instant. The hero suddenly appeared in front of her. He grinned and asked if these trash were the same hunters she had mentioned earlier in the conversation. She sweated, thinking she hadn't even noticed when her opponent had gotten so close, and was terrified she would die, losing all the ambition she had worked so hard for. The brunette passed by and, closing his eyes, said he didn't kill women, so she shouldn't block his way. The woman stretched her lips into a smile and thought this was very foolish of him. She frowned and decided she would make him regret this choice. She suddenly turned around and hit her so hard that she flew into the wall. He smiled and said he thought about it and realized that, since she was married to a creature, she shouldn't be considered a woman or a person at all. The creature landed in front of him, saying the hero was a very interesting guy. The governor looked down at him and noticed there was no magical power coming from his body, so he was neither a hunter nor a creature, but he still had such strength. The youth clenched his fist with a grin. He swung and said this was called martial arts. The youth landed a blow on the enemy, and everything around him shook, raising a cloud of dust. The enemy opened his mouth and asked if his art was really that strong. The creature blocked the attack and said his comrades once came to a world where they ruled supreme. But there were several experts whose strength was impressive. But the martial artists of this world were just trash, weaker than hunters, and the youth proved he was very weak. The brunette grinned and stayed silent. His hand turned red after using the layer 18 golden bell. Then armor appeared on his legs from the layer 12 iron shirt, and half of his head was covered in the body of the layer 16 black demon lord, and the hero used the 9 changes of the 3rd layer golden body. He stretched his neck and said this feeling really made him feel free and relaxed. He suddenly grabbed the enemy's face and added he didn't care about anything more than the enemy's cries. The guy slammed the creature in the floor with force. It groaned in pain and exclaimed he wasn't even human. So, what was he? She sneered and asked how the corrupt creatures who treated human lives as food could understand the true meaning of martial arts. But he was actually able to condense the great preparation using the 5G towards Yuan technique, surpassing the limits of the human race and becoming a true immortal. A few years ago in the martial arts world, 2 warriors were surrounded by creatures, and the youth shouted that the demonic beasts were still here. He gritted his teeth as he noticed they were surrounded. The alliance leader swung his blade, cutting down the enemy. The old man frowned and muttered this place was a trap, but what he didn't expect was that he would die along with the leader of the demon cult. The red-haired woman raised her hands with purple threads and asked if this was all the leader of the 5 Peaks Blades Alliance could do, and then why not let her drain his body dry and fill herself with internal energy so she could deal with a couple more demonic beasts. A large paw crushed the young man. The demon's eyes flashed and grinned that these little humans were still fighting, and the old man cursed because they barely defeated him, working together. The leader frowned and muttered their path would end here. The enemy swung his paw, shouting he would eat them. Suddenly a bright beam pierced his chest. The body fell on the ground in front of the old man. The hero smirked and noted they were both still alive. The allies raised their heads, and the man realized she had become stronger again. The woman blushed and said his true energy was looking more and more tempting, and offered to merge in joint cultivation, and then their children would surely become the strongest martial artists in history. The brunette grinned and refused, reminding her he was chasing the peak of the dial of martial arts. The old man narrowed his eyes and said the guy arrived just in time, because together with him, they would definitely escape the encirclement of the demonic beast. The brunette jumped to the ground and was upset that he wanted to flee, because he was going to finish off the one who betrayed them. The young man walked past with a smile when the other exclaimed their opponent was the strongest master of this world from the Heavenly Blade clan, and said he would go first, asking the man to try not to die or he would visit his grave every year to laugh. The old man grinned and replied he was still very powerful and would live 200 years, so the young man better try not to die sooner. The hero leaped to meet the creatures and shouted the leader should save this energy and show strength like when fighting him. The brunette rushed forward, ripping off the demon's limbs and shouting all these beasts must be defeated. The man clenched his teeth through which blood flowed. He hung, pierced by the creature's tentacles, and next to him stood a fair-haired man. The brunette narrowed his eyes and asked why he betrayed them. The dark entity behind Qin Yan laughed and noted that, thanks to him, all the masters of the world were defeated in one swoop. So how did he feel watching his friends die right in front of his face? The demon darkened and muttered he hated the silent ones, and his second face noticed the new guest. The hero landed on the creature's head, slamming it into the ground, and the black entity noted he looked like a worthy foe to stretch his legs and have fun with. The blonde raised his hand and drew a blue line in front of him, causing the demon to scream he almost died. The long-haired one's eyes flashed and declared this was his opponent. The creature looked at him, glad he could talk after all, and added he just wanted to help, since his job was to protect the guy until the ceremony was done. She stood in front of his opponent, asking why he had allied with demons, and the other replied it was for the sake of the peak of the Tao of martial arts. The brunette chuckled and noted his brain had completely rotted, since it was very foolish to betray his friends and join a demonic beast for such a goal. The blond man furrowed his brows and said these people were not his friends, because they never understood him chasing wealth, respect, power, but the Tao of martial arts was just a tool for them. But she is the same because he chases an unreal legend, immortality, the peak. The guy shrugged and clarified, would an alliance with demons make him immortal, like a sweet fruit that even tempts him? Yuan clenched his fists and said the hero with his terrifying talent for martial arts gave him an urgent need to train with all his might. And today, his skills have surpassed all the ancestors in the history of the Heavenly Blade clan. But this is the end of the path of the Tao of martial arts. There is no further road and immortality is impossible to achieve. He smiled and invited the hero to stand by his side, noting he would be able to surpass even his potential after turning into a demonic beast. And as soon as they complete the transformation ceremony, they will find a path that belongs only to them. The black entity leaned over the blonde, surprised he was going to give half of the energy from the sacrifices of the masters of this world. But the man explained he was a worthy warrior. The demon turned to the brunette and said that, judging by their information, this guy was completely different from the long-haired one who was born from the strongest clan in the world, and he was a beggar reliant on the criminal gang he joined and somehow learned a simple martial art, but all he had was effort. So, he became only the second master. The shadow emitted energy and shouted he should be glad he was worthy of becoming one of them and living forever. But she said he did not need it. The guy grinned and replied he did not want to become a beast. Moreover, the information was wrong, and he was not second after the blonde. The hero swung, focusing energy, and said he would destroy the enemy and then the demon. The opponent extended his hand, calling for the heavenly blade, and agreed they would have to convince his body since words were useless. The warriors clashed in battle and their magic flashed around. She bared his teeth and clenched his fist, shouting that, for the end of his martial arts path, it was somehow weak. But the other admitted he pitied him. The long-haired man began to advance, waving his sword. Their energies clashed with each other. The hero's eyes flashed and he swung, offering to settle everything with one blow. Yuan prepared a blue beam of mana and agreed. The opponents exchanged attacks. A powerful blast fell to the ground, raising stones around. A few drops of blood fell to the ground. It flowed from the man's hand. She turned to the enemy and asked if he was convinced now, and the blonde noted he was lucky to be ahead of him by one move, and the victory was his. The brunette approached, saying this was not luck, and in the future he would beat him twice, 3 times each time. Suddenly one of the blonde's eyes flared with black flame, and he replied it was too late, because the transformation ceremony had begun. His body was inside a purple sphere to which energy was drawn. The hero stood not far from him. Bright threads were pulled to the villain, draining the strength out of the people and creatures around him. The creatures bared their teeth, flashing their red eyes, and shouted, "Evolution! Immortality!" The dark army looked at the purple sphere and rejoiced. A bright flash appeared in the sky, lighting everything around. A bright face appeared from behind the black feathers. Yuan spread his wings, showing his new form. The demon raised his head and admired the talent of the warrior, who had only just completed the transformation ceremony and had already surpassed the legionnaire level and reached the commander. The blonde opened his mouth and told the hero this was his last chance. He extended his hand, hovering in front of the brunette, and said this world was finished, but he could come with him and conquer countless places beyond the sky to find his way. She smirked and laughed at the ugliness of his opponent, asking if this was the power he wanted and for which he betrayed his martial art. The other suddenly appeared in front of his face, and the youth widened his eyes. The opponent placed his hand on his chest. A powerful energy burst out from it, crashing down on the hero. She frowned, receiving a hole in the heart, and muttered he was hitting from behind. The blonde and the demon moved toward the purple portal to go to the next world. The brunette saw them leaving through half-closed eyes. She gritted his teeth as he lay on the ground, muttering that failing to master his martial art and dying here was a joke, but he would definitely finish Yuan off, no matter which world he went to. The silhouettes vanished into the sparkling rift. The portal shrank, and suddenly voices were heard. The heavens will punish the traitors. Let's take Shishan back. The boy opened his eyes slightly, trying to figure out if he really died at the hands of Yuan. He sat in the room, surrounded by bodies, and mentally noted the fancy furniture and decoration in an unfamiliar style. The young man lowered his gaze and noticed the well-made clothes that would need to be adjusted at the tailor. The brunette squinted and realized he couldn't move a finger. His bones were broken, there was internal bleeding. But more importantly, this was a different body with weaker muscles and no trace of energy. Suddenly, the bespectacled man appeared at the door, addressed him by name, and asked if he could hear him. The guy quickly approached, saying there was no time left, and if he did not escape now, it would be too late. He looked into the room, saying something about a traitor, but then he stopped. The stranger flinched, noticing that In Jing Min, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, was dead, although he could have been used alive. The young man grabbed his head and shouted that this traitor deserved to die. And since he was dead, the signing of the peace treaty would be paused for a while, but it was not safe here now. He turned his attention to Qi, who was sitting quietly. His friend approached him and noted with relief that he was still breathing. The bespectacled man picked him up and said he would carry him to the hospital. and when the brunette returned, he would become a hero. Suddenly, a fair-haired man entered the office, saying that kids were only capable of playing games with their protests, riots, and banners, calling themselves heroes. He stepped on the hand of one of the bodies. The bones cracked under his weight. The man looked down and frowned. He looked at the young men in shock and asked if it was really a corpse. The stranger laughed in surprise and shouted that they were completely crazy to have killed In Jing-min, so they could even forget about the riots in the diplomat's official residence. The man closed his eyes and added he did not understand them at all. What made Shishan University students with a bright future do such a thing? The bespectacled man frowned and shouted that he had to stop asking questions as if he did not understand anything, since it was all to prevent the signing of the peace treaty. The blonde smirked and reminded him that, after the fighting ended, it took the Shishan government almost a month to finalize all the details of the talks. The hard-earned peace between humans and creatures, and the little brats had ruined it all. The other man gritted his teeth and shouted that he himself was a traitor for stepping over his comrades when he gave up human territory to creatures, and that this was just a sham, not a peace treaty. But it must be great for him to kill a bunch of people, and then talk about peace, pretending not to know that the ambitions of creatures would never be satisfied. The man gestured with his hand and argued that, at least, they were alive, and the school kids were only starting another war with their actions. He suddenly reached forward. The man grabbed the surprised, bespectacled man by the throat and asked if he really wanted to stare at the blood shed and death. The young man frowned and began to choke, demanding to be released. The blonde man glared fiercely and said their games had gone too far, and they had crossed the line, so now they would die. He let go of the neck, which still had marks on it. The man raised his eyebrows and added it was a joke, because the precious students of Shishan University could not die here. The students sank to the floor and coughed, and the other said such a death would be too good for them. The prison building was lit with lights. The students looked down at the people from above with anger and demanded to be freed, chanting that the heavens would punish the traitors and restore Shishan. The men looked down at them, and the brunette noted there was a lot of noise and asked how many people were arrested in total, to which the other replied that all London 96 university students who were seen taking part in the rebellion. The blonde crossed his arms and asked him not to be mad and to consider it a gift, because the governor's office had set important goals for his prison, and active and passionate students were perfect as material for tests. The warden frowned and reminded him that this was the largest university in the region, from which many major political figures graduated, and he did not want any trouble for himself. The brunette turned to the man who said he was scared, and countered he was simply worried about public opinion and the consequences for the peace treaty, to which the other said the prisoners had killed the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So, the big shots at the top were quite upset with them, which meant that, in a couple of days after the peace treaty was signed, they could be used for tests. The head of the prison chuckled and guessed why they were sent under his care, and the blonde warned that, earlier, a student was brought to the prison cell who, according to their information, had been practicing martial arts since childhood and also killed Injing, who was under the protection of 5 armed guards. The brunette raised his eyebrows with a smile and reminded that the head warden of this prison is a C-rank hunter. He licked his lips and shouted that martial arts are just garbage that no one has used for many years. There were rugs on the floor of the room. The hero opened his eyes. He crouched down, trying to figure out who brought him and where. But what is also important is that his injuries began to worsen, as if he was racing with death. The boy smirked and realized he would die if he failed to cultivate qi and stabilize his condition, and remembered that, in his past life, he was born into a poor family and practiced unusual martial arts techniques to survive. The brunette sat in the lotus position and closed his eyes, thinking he had failed to build a strong foundation of Kwai in the early stages of his training. And this small mistake greatly affected the progress of all later training, because it depends on the quality of the foundation, just like building a regular structure. But now he had a chance to start over. The youth knitted his brows, thinking his mind had kept many training techniques. Combined with the practical experience of decades, he would soon surpass his past self. A blue flame ignited in his abdomen, and the hero decided the pure yang technique was perfect for this body, and then was surprised that, in just a few breaths, the true Kai of pure yang was cultivated. So this body was full of talent. Suddenly, the flame vanished into thin air. He opened his eyes in confusion, not understanding why the true Ki had evaporated, and decided to try something else. A Medba internal Qigong, the Jade Heart Sutra, the Great Prajna Nirvana Dharma, and even Kundalini Yoga. The brunette widened his eyes in confusion, realizing all the Qi energy he had cultivated had disappeared somewhere. A light bluish force came from his body, and the guy noted that, if he had not been able to cultivate, he would have died long ago. But he felt his wounds healing by themselves, which meant the Qi had been absorbed by this body. The hero grinned and noted he was going through amazing changes. The bespectacled man appeared in the doorway, happy his friend had woken up. He gritted his teeth and shouted that those jerks refused to provide him with medical care and left him to die. So, the young man himself could only wash and bandage his wounds. The hero looked at the guest, thanked him, and asked him to give his name, adding he would repay this debt sooner or later. Mangu Xian shuddered and introduced himself, reminding him he was his classmate and best friend. The brunette frowned and replied he did not recall such a thing, and he did not need friends, they only let him down. The bespectacled man sat down opposite and asked if he really had lost his memory. They swapped looks, and she answered that his thoughts were in total chaos and couldn't recall anything from before. But he overheard someone call his name, and his pal understood that this was full memory loss that needed handling. The learner started to share something, waving his hands energetically, and the lead nodded carefully. The dark-haired guy scratched his jaw and decided that this land had been overrun by creatures, and people had lost a third of their territory, and were attempting to broker peace through deals, and they were all pupils at Shishan Academy, who, to stop the peace agreement from being finalized, had marched to the streets to rally under the guidance of a dissenter. But the true scheme was to abduct the official in Jing. Yet everything went awry, and he had slain the man, after which they were tossed into jail. The speaker gazed at him and stated that the dissenters wouldn't forsake them and would soon free them from here. But the dark-haired guy remarked that his voice didn't spark trust, and how powerful these dissenters were, and how many creatures they had defeated. The glasses-wearing man scowled and said, 10,000 creatures and over 300 betrayers of mankind. The main character smirked and asked, what about yesterday? The friends glanced at each other, and the dark-haired guy figured he had only mentioned the overall count. Chi's eyes gleamed and decided that the dissenters were feeble, proclaiming that he would haul him out of here himself. The courtyard was enclosed by a tall barrier and electric cables. The lad stepped ahead. Gin chased his friend, saying that his body required rest, so let him return to relax, but he replied that he had nearly healed. He glanced away and mumbled that it was odd. The speaker looked at him with worry and asked what was wrong if he felt sick. The lead scanned around eagerly and shouted that there were lunatics in this nation, letting wrongdoers live in such fine conditions, and the pupil covered his face with his hand, clarifying that the pupils of Shishan Academy were granted a unique status even while detained. Someone grinned and shouted that she had awakened. Several guys stared at them, saying they knew he wouldn't be killed so quickly. Besides, he had slain Injing men and blocked them from finalizing the peace agreement. The pupils gathered around the lead, talking that he would surely become a notable figure, so he shouldn't forget them either. But the guy seated nearby just sneered. The glasses-wearing man glared at Zhou Xian with annoyance and insisted that he speak plainly if he disliked something. The youth stood up and pointed at the main character, asking if he truly saw himself as a hero. He scowled and reminded him that he had said he'd join the rally, but he had secretly murdered an official, which he boasted about, and they had been locked up too. She slipped her hands into her pockets and muttered that she didn't mind, and his pals defended him, saying he had risked his life for this mission and nearly perished, all to stop them from signing a peace deal at any price. So, did his speaker really feel sorry? Sheen clenched his teeth and replied that he did feel sorry because, in 3 days the jailer had taken 6 pupils for questioning and none returned, and now they were all dead bodies that nobody would rescue, and it was terrifying to imagine what was happening with the girls in the other section. A man in a suit neared the group and noted that it was very active. Apparently he had arrived at a bad time. Guang Xian and she turned to the jailer, and the glasses-wearing man demanded that his classmates be brought back. The dark-haired guy laughed and asked them not to take it so gravely, but he considered it and brought them something to divert themselves. He waved his arm and ordered the TV to be fetched. 2 men rolled in a big screen. The main character raised an eyebrow and noted that not only did they let them dwell in such a grand house, but they also offered amusement, so they could plan an escape later. The youth tapped the screen and asked how to activate this device, to which the guard mumbled that the guy who managed to kill the official had totally lost his senses, so they could handle him later. There would be ample time for talk. The man pressed the button on the remote. The screen lit up with a distinct sound. The host smiled and declared that, after 30 days of talks, the long-awaited ceasefire had been reached. Due to confusion caused by differences in cultural beliefs, visitors from other realms had sadly clashed with mankind, and the conflict that lasted a full year had caused many losses on both the human and war leaders' side. And today, in the border region of Shishan, a peace deal was signed between mankind and the war leaders. On the screen, a huge creature was shaking hands with a man. The captive stared at the TV, and the woman added that the border was split by western cliffs, on the southern side of which there was a zone temporarily occupied and governed by war leaders. Someone dropped to their knees. The pupils' eyes widened and asked if the peace deal had really been finalized and their efforts were futile. The glasses-wearing man scowled and shouted that this was false. How could the agreement be finalized so fast if the foreign minister was dead? The jailer grinned and asked if they truly thought a few pupils could alter history's path, that the death of one official would change the fated future of 2 races. The man raised his eyebrows and asked them not to be absurd, and if they couldn't see clearly, they'd only be pawns in the game of the mighty, and they were deserted because the Shishan temporary government was tired of them, and the dissenters would never waste their strength on them at such a tough time. So, their only worth was their young bodies, ideal for tests in this jail. Guangxian scowled and asked what this lunatic had done to their friends, adding that the news would discover it. The man grinned wickedly and countered that nobody would find out, but even if they did, he'd be praised for the future he crafted. The jailer nudged the glasses-wearing man and noted that it wasn't his turn today, since the subject of the test would be their great hero who had risen from the dead. The main character smirked, noting that the trick of putting people and animals in a cage was surely intriguing, but it was already dull, so let him have fun, or he'd escape from here. The guy slammed his fist on the bars. Guanjin clenched his teeth and muttered that he couldn't wait any longer, and they'd have to save themselves, but they should act soon. Sheen scowled and shouted that he was now acting like some kind of hero. But when their classmates were taken 2 days ago, he did nothing. The speaker looked at him and replied that the situation was entirely different, and now they were forsaken as soon as the peace deal was signed, and if he wasn't going to die here as an object of the jailer's tests, then he should join the rebellion and flee this nightmare with them. The red-haired man slipped his hand into his pocket and replied that it was all about Ki, who had been taken by the boss, and that's why the glasses-wearing man was furious. But he said he wanted to save his other friends too, as well as the girls locked in another area. The guy sitting on his knees raised his eyebrows and laughed, saying that the jailer was a predator, and this jail was guarded by a bunch of creatures, so they couldn't do anything. The pupils surrounded Guangxin, shouting that the minister's death achieved nothing, and the peace deal was signed anyway, and they were sent to slaughter, and all their pain was because of him. Xian scowled and said that she had been caught and sent for a test, which he deserved even if he died, and nobody would come to save him. The door to the lab, the dark-haired girl, and the masked man stood over the test subject, and he announced that, based on the outcomes of the prior session, the dose of the trigger had been cut in half, and the makeup of drug number 4 had been adjusted, and then declared the start of the 350th session. The blonde pupil scowled and asked why Sun Manga wanted to become their betrayer. The dark-haired girl took the needle and replied that she was doing everything to survive, and before her eyes, 12 classmates had already turned into puddles of blood, twisting in agony. And though she thought it'd be frightening, in the end, she could only chuckle at how they looked. The speaker raised her eyebrows and objected that she wasn't that kind of person, and they were best pals. Manga leaned over and smirked, saying she never thought so. Moreover, she despised the behavior of such a wealthy girl the most. The patient's eyes widened as she stared at the sharp needle with venom. 2 men walked down the hallway, and a piercing scream was heard ahead. The main character slipped his hands into his pockets, following the jailer, and mumbled that these screams were making him drowsy, hoping he hadn't been brought here for some kind of torment with all sorts of junk, and the speaker responded that he wouldn't disappoint. He cracked the door open slightly. Manga covered her mouth, staring at the mess on the floor, and the man noted that they had just reached the most thrilling part. A bloody substance slid behind the chair, screaming in pain. Tears streamed from empty eye sockets, and a voice begged for aid. The dark-haired girl stepped on her with disdain and demanded that he not approach her. She smirked and muttered that it was so revolting, and her former girlfriend now smelled so bad. There were smoking scraps on the floor. The jailer approached the worker collecting the material and noted that, sadly, the test had failed again, and he replied that the idea behind drug number 4 was correct because, after lowering the dose of the trigger, the subject could keep its shape after death and didn't turn into a puddle of blood. She raised an eyebrow and asked if they really wanted to show him how people turned into creatures. The man spread his arms and shouted that he could see a breakthrough that would change the world, and he'd become the trailblazer who altered it. The dark-haired girl looked at him and decided that he simply enjoyed killing people. The speaker's eyes sparkled and noted that, apparently, the youth didn't grasp anything, but the war between people and creatures would only truly end when all of mankind became creatures. He introduced the blonde man with wings and said that, at the moment, there was only one known successful case among the countless realms invaded by creatures. Only in one of them, the miracle of turning a human into a creature happened. The overseer hugged his worker and said that everything would soon change because, using the technology of their realm, they had made huge progress in studying the process of turning into a creature, and even the great nature that was once a human had noticed it. The main character smirked and shouted that this was splendid, asking if the creature who had rejected his humanity was also somewhere here. The speaker smiled wildly and replied that the master's power was far beyond the level of a soldier, and this realm wasn't yet able to withstand such strength. But on the day of his arrival, the trailblazers would earn the highest praise. He approached the pupil and added that, for the sake of his brilliant future, it was Chi, as a terrible wrongdoer who laid hands on the minister, who would become part of his achievements. Purple marks appeared around the youth's forearm and bone. They spread over his whole body, and the hero asked about what they were. The man took the needle and asked Manga to continue to see what effect drug number 4 would have on someone who practiced combat skills. He hugged the girl, but she shouted that the hero would kill her if he rashly approached. The jailer stuck out his tongue, touching the girl's lips, and said that he was very pleased with her work both day and night, so he couldn't allow such a useful tool to perish, and he restricted the boy's movements with his mental power. Now he couldn't move a finger. She smirked and muttered, "Is this really the strength of a predator? Which is very curious." The man looked at the boy and shouted that he had felt the huge gap between fighters and predators. The girl took the needle from his hands. Manga scowled and turned to the dark-haired guy, saying that it was because of him that they ended up in this mess, and she just wanted to live, so he should understand her and stay quiet. The jailer grinned and asked how the boy felt about being betrayed by his comrades, adding that rejected fighters would become much more valuable as creatures. The girl swung her arm and said farewell, calling the boy a useless hero. She glared at her and offered to say it again. The speaker's eyes widened in fear when a needle was jabbed into her neck. She tried to break free, but the dark-haired guy held her hand firmly. The youth smirked and asked how it worked. The dark-haired girl grimaced in fear, but the main character firmly pressed the needle and injected her with venom. The jailer looked at them in confusion, not understanding what was happening because he had surely immobilized the pupil with his power. The girl's body shook and began to transform when she turned to the man. Manga turned around, showing a horrible mouth, and mumbled that she wanted to eat. The jailer jumped back and his worker was caught by a new creature. The main character stood behind the man who didn't grasp anything, saying numbers. He turned around and nervously asked what he was counting. The hero smirked and answered that this was the time during which his injuries would fully heal, and now he could finish him off. She suddenly leapt up and slammed his speaker into the floor. Purple sparks flashed in the air. The man sank near the wall, and part of his face glowed with energy. The youth looked through the hole in the wall and noted that it was as if he had hit a bar of soap. It didn't feel like flesh at all, and asked if he had really used that odd mental trick again. The overseer's eyes sparkled and explained that a Sarank predator could cover his entire body with the energy of the mind, which was enough to withstand a missile strike. So an empty space like a hero wouldn't leave a mark on it. The youth smirked and decided that he should explore the abilities of predators. After which, he asked to show his strength again in exchange for the chance to live a bit longer. The man twisted unnaturally as he rose and advised the guy to watch his words because even the best fighter in the world could barely compare to a C-rank predator. He glanced at the pupil and added that he'd never win. The jailer extended his hand and attacked with a purple disc. The projectile smashed into the wall next to the hero's head, but he only leaned to the side. The dark-haired guy shook off his jacket and noted that the destructive power was good, but not focused enough and used too much energy, and the movement was average. The angle of attack shifted twice, but the second turn was too sharp and easy to dodge. The man created 2 spheres on his palms and smirked that the guy was acting like a reality show, and asked to consider the prior attack just a greeting. He extended his hands and sent several projectiles flying, asking if the hero really thought he could only shoot once. His face twisted while the jailer suggested that his opponent run and see if he could dodge. The main character dashed to the side, nimbly avoiding the projectiles. At some point, he pushed off the wall with a smirk. The guy grinned and thought that, without the shield of ki, this frail body would crumble at the first hit, which only made it more fun. He threw a rock. It smashed into the opponent's energy shield. The man grimaced and asked if the pupil was really tossing rocks. The dark-haired guy picked up a handful. Then he threw them all at once. The jailer grinned as the rocks crashed into his defense and shouted that the boy was ridiculous if he seriously thought this would break through his mental shield. The hero smiled and replied that it was worth a try. He suddenly threw the last rock. It bounced off the others, and the opponent only muttered that the pupil was insane. A zigzag appeared in the air from behind the rocks in front of the jailer, which unexpectedly hypnotized him. The main character recalled the man in the robe leaning over the boy and thought that a skilled hypnotist could invade someone's mind through words, sounds, actions, and even eyes. He pictured a burning candle and a pocket watch. The guy imagined a ninja and noted that, in the world of combat arts, one clan whose attack methods included hidden weapons and tossing objects created a hypnosis technique that lets you enter the mind of an opponent using the path and sound of a thrown weapon without using true ki. And its effects can put the enemy in a state of imaginary weightlessness, confusion, and even coma. She suddenly appeared in front of the enemy, striking him with her fists. He closed his eyes, coming to his senses. He looked at the boy and asked if he had played enough. The man activated the spheres on his palms and shouted that, at such a close distance, he couldn't escape. The guy touched his enemy's shield with his finger, and it split. The shock wave threw the jailer back. She looked at him and noted that the defense was impressive because it took 16 hits and 3 seconds in one spot to break through. The opponent leaned on his feet and cursed, outraged that he didn't respect him. He scowled and shouted that the hero could have killed him if he had used a bit more force. So why did he stop? The guy smiled and reminded him that he was simply studying mental abilities, so he wouldn't let him die until he finished figuring it out. The speaker scowled and was angry that the pupil was using him as a test subject and added that he was just lucky now, but he missed his last chance to finish him off because his little trick wouldn't work again. She quickly approached and hit the enemy in the chest with her knee. He flew back and laughed. He smirked and shouted that it was pointless because his mental defense had already been restored, and there'd be no chance to attack him so often anymore. The dark-haired guy came closer and noted that there was no point in studying if you attacked him the same way repeatedly. Suddenly, blood spurted from the guard's mouth. He bent over and asked what he had done to him, and the youth explained that, while he was breaking through the defense, he had studied the strength, durability, and number of vibrations per second of his mental ability. And knowing these traits, he could now directly attack his body with his mental power. The guy rubbed his jaw and added that it was rare for two people to have such a precise match in mental traits, so, if you need to break through the opponent's mental defense before using this technique, it was of little use. And in a real fight, victory or defeat could be decided by the first breakthrough of someone else's defense. The guard grimaced, clutching his chest, and thought that this maniac was impossible to understand with common sense. Scarlet shells flew down the hallway. The man in the cap turned around, hearing the sounds of blasts. The partners turned around, assuming that someone wanted to flee from the jail, but the second one quickly reminded that there was a questioning room with a guard on the other side, so that was impossible. The leader appeared in front of them, constantly attacking, and shouted at them to move aside. The guards were instantly killed and the man rushed on. He stopped and asked if they had finally managed to finish off the opponent. The smoke cleared, and the hero's voice was heard asking where he ran off to because he enjoyed tests so much. She appeared in front of him and offered to continue the tests. The man sat on his knees in front of the speaker, asking again. He raised his battered face and muttered that he had a copy of that key, but he didn't know which room it was for. The man extended his hand toward him, activating the energy, and said that he was from the room of the former minister, and the speaker fearfully asked to be let go, muttering that he didn't want to know. A purple glow came from the predator's hand, black tentacles grew from the ground, and he ordered them to consume the man. He tried to lunge forward, screaming that he was mistaken and shouldn't have agreed to this. He went underground screaming. Only a black puddle remained on the pavement, and the blonde standing behind asked if his colleague had finished. The speaker looked at him and answered yes, adding that everyone involved in the case had been fully eliminated, as well as the evidence, and if he killed him too, nobody would know that Injing's death was planned by him. The man smirked and asked him not to joke like that since he was his best worker, and he couldn't afford to lose him. But he still couldn't say that everyone involved was finished since the death of their most important witness, the scapegoat, hadn't been confirmed yet. The dark-haired guy looked at him, and asked why the youth was so important since it took a lot of time and effort to frame Chi for the official's murder, all to make the incident look natural and not raise suspicion. The blonde exhaled smoke and replied that the owner of the Ming Xian Combat School, Sueda, was the true power behind the city before the demons appeared, and his influence reached both the criminal world and lawful society, earning respect even from large companies. The speaker looked at his boss in surprise and muttered that he grew up on tales about this man. The man smiled and said that, over 10 years ago, Zua adopted an orphan and named him Zuchi. But the boy said that he didn't understand what the issue was. Even the strongest fighter of Shishin at the moment was no match for even a B-rank predator. The blonde man's eyes sparkled and said that, besides the well-known Ming Xian school, this so-called useless old man owns several unclear shady assets hidden from public view, such as the Black Snake Group, a branch of the combat school, though most of its members are just common thugs, but they have access to a lot of secret knowledge. The predator gestured and asked if they were dissenters, and the other man noted that he was clever, adding that, when the war ended, these shady figures, like rats in a sewer, completely vanished, and if you were going to root out the dissenters, you'd have to rely on the knowledge network of these thugs. The dark-haired guy sweated and said that, of course, capturing the dissenters, especially their leader, would be a big achievement, but if their involvement was uncovered, there'd be trouble. The man grinned and said that he wouldn't have the courage if he were alone. But the death of the minister, as well as the takeover of the Black Snake Group, is tied to power schemes at the top, and behind him there's a strong group. Even though he's the director of the data analysis unit, he doesn't plan to live out his life stuck in this dull role. Then he asked if the guy plans to spend the rest of his life as the squad leader. The speaker stretched his lips into a smile and replied that he had his own goals, and that's why he was with them. After which, he asked whether to deal with Chi too. The predator took out a new cigarette and asked not to do anything because that pupil was a key figure in this incident, and to avoid trouble for the boss, it was worth keeping distance from him. The guy came closer and asked what would happen if the hero healed from his injuries, woke up and started talking, and he answered that he purposely left the guy alive to use him as bait. The man lit a cigarette and suggested that Ming Xian and the combat school would step in and save the boy, which would benefit them as it would provide the perfect chance to lure out Suda so they could sway him to listen. And, at the same time, it would be an excuse to kill Chi. Though of course the old man had already lost the will to fight, so there was a chance that he wouldn't go to save his son. But, in that case, the foolish jailer would finish the guy off and help tie up loose ends. The blonde smirked and added that, in any case, no matter how the main character died, it wasn't up to him to decide what crime he'd be convicted of, and the combat school itself was already under suspicion of working with the dissenters. And if the old man wanted to save the lives of the pupils, he'd have to sacrifice the Black Snake Group. Dusk was falling over the jail. The jailer rushed forward calling for aid and asking the boy not to approach. The creature opened its mouth and told him to be quiet. It looked down at the man and asked why he was panicking, hearing in response that he was being chased by a captive. Another creature approached Limbs and said that he claimed this trash wasn't fit to work as a jailer. and the speaker snapped that then they'd have to do the jailer's job themselves. But now, thanks to this loyal servant, they live happily here. Footsteps were heard nearing. The hero stepped closer and inquired if the man had located help. He flinched in fright and cautioned Limbs and Olibi to be cautious with this captive. He darted past, pleading for him to halt him, and was about to sound the alert and summon aid. The beast scowled and was annoyed that he had just fled and deserted them. Limbs towered over the hero and declared that he would seize and devour this guard as soon as he handled the captive. The beast extended his hand with glowing power, yelling that no one dares to speak about food without his consent. A strong ray shot out toward the hero. The guy smiled and mumbled that it was the claw weapon again. He deflected the strike and remarked that he would have been safe if he had stood a bit nearer. The young man clenched his fist, shattering the casing. She pulled the foe, stating that such an outdated tactic was already dull. He effortlessly tossed the foe to the ground. The second one assumed a combat pose and stared at him. The main hero shut his eyes and asked if he was going to disrupt his tests too, because he generally did not object to defeating a couple of shielded creatures, though this is a rare guarded species. The foe stomped his foot. Limbs glared at the young man from behind and shouted that this assault was harmless and did not leave a mark. The youth spun around with a smile, noting that he had recovered so fast. After all, without developing true essence, it was very tough to harm them in a direct clash. The beast encircled him, asking if he had truly surrendered, but he would not escape alive for offending their tribe as shielded creatures. She smiled and pointed out that the sixth part of the limb could not bear the strain if bent backward. The eyes were especially vulnerable to light, and in the fourth part of the spine, there was a tiny gap hidden by the casing. The foe frowned and questioned how he knew this. The youth swung his arm quickly, severing the foe's limb, and replied if that was really a mystery. The demon opened its jaws and yelled in agony. Limbs stared at the boy, muttering that the weak spots of the hands and eyes were minor, but who revealed the hidden flaw of the spine, and the hero answered that he had examined 200 or 300 shielded beasts, so he likely knew their structure better than they did, but what he recalled most was the dry, tough, and bitter flesh of their kind, very unpleasant to consume. The young man raised his eyebrows and added that, honestly, for a fighter, exploiting the foe's weak spots was a particularly disgraceful strategy, and if anyone discovered it, he would surely be ridiculed. The foe swung and replied that it was not too late to battle with honor. The boy smiled and noted that no one was observing here, so he could slay them all, and no one would know about his shameful deed. The prison structure. The guard was shoving one of the rebels, demanding that he move quicker. The man gritted his teeth and mumbled that he was mistaken about him since authority and wealth had altered him so much that he betrayed his allies. Xing smiled and replied that if they were allies, he should be happy to do him a favor. So, let him relax and assist, recalling his wife and newborn child. The other person lunged toward him, shouting that he would slay him. The beast swung its claw. He pinned the rebel to the ground and asked what he wanted to do with his loyal servant, thanks to whom he managed to capture over 40 rebels and earn a good prize. The demon showed its teeth and asked the rebel army's contact officer to give him the names of everyone he knew, and then he would be spared. The brunette scowled and said that he had nothing to tell. The overseer turned to Limbs and remarked that these people were keeping silent. They were not so easy to break, so let him leave this job to him. Under torment, the officer would reveal everything he knew. The beast lifted the captive and sneered that Siren was so harsh with his look that he liked him more and more. So, this time he would entrust him with all the rebels that were caught. The brunette scowled and cursed, saying that his craving for power would be his ruin, and he would be consumed by his greed and perish in pain. At this moment, the guard slammed the control device onto the table. He clutched his head, not grasping why he was remembering the past now, and the upkeep staff had become completely idle since the communication setup that was damaged during the conflict had not yet been fixed, and even the phones were not working, and the prison alert had also been wrecked in the recent fight and was not operating at all. A blast sounded. The man turned around, realizing that he had a rush, and exclaimed that he had never seen such a skilled fighter before, who could defeat 2 Sarank beasts alone. Singh sweated and mumbled that there was the slightest chance that the demons would be beaten, considering that he could not rely on outside aid. Only death awaited him. He slammed his fists on the table and yelled that this was simply absurd because the guard had done so much to become the leader of the prison, and he had not yet reached the peak of his career. His life had just started. The man trembled and noted that there was hope because there was still a temporary alert system for testing in Block A. Spotlights were shining from behind one of the prison structures. Suddenly, a strong blast was heard in this place. The students looked at Sheen in surprise and asked if he really wanted them to flee themselves and abandon Chi and Guanjin to their fate. The red-haired man scowled and replied that the main character was a brave man without sense who had slain the Minister of Foreign Affairs, which was why their scheme had failed, and they had been jailed. And the bespectacled man was simply a two-faced scholar who had dared to venture into danger with a couple of classmates just to save a friend. And this was a catastrophe because the student's actions would only lead to the comrades who had trusted him losing their lives for nothing. The other person looked at him with displeasure and exclaimed that he was simply scared of dying himself and was hiding behind his words. Sheen smiled and agreed, saying that he wanted to survive, And now was their chance since there were riots and blasts everywhere in the prison, and Chi and Guangan had once again played heroes and drew the attention of the guards. The guy turned around and said that it was up to them to decide whether to stay here and sink with them or not. One of the students stepped forward and said that he would go with him, which caused the anger of another young man. 2 students had already passed him, saying that they wanted to live, and that their families were waiting for them at home. Sheehan smiled and said that there was no need to feel guilty because of the fear of death, and it was Chai who should seek forgiveness, and they would prepare to flee. One of the guys went to the door and exclaimed that they could get through here if they broke it down together. Suddenly, the guard kicked him sharply and threw the guy back. The students froze in fear, looking at their friend. The man stared at them and mumbled that they were unlucky to encounter him, but so be it. He would lighten their punishment for the service. Sheehan looked at the brunette and mumbled that they were just frightened because of the blasts. Xing passed by and said that many people would not be needed, but he would finish off anyone who did not follow him. The student rushed after him, promising that he would do everything to assist him. The beast's body broke into pieces. The red-haired man's eyes widened and he screamed. The guard gritted his teeth and mumbled that these foolish demons were slain too quickly. The hero slammed the beast into the ground, sitting on top of it. Sheehan stared at his classmate in shock, assuming that he had become so powerful because of the test. She stood up and noted with a smile that now there was no man or creature left who could stop them. The man spread his arms and promised that he would cooperate with him, free all his comrades, and provide them with temporary refuge to hide from the demons. But the young man replied that his only fate was to be his subject for tests. The students looked at the hero, exclaiming that everything was fine with him and he would rescue them, and the red-haired man said that the brunette was to blame for the fact that they all ended up in this prison, and now their rescue was his duty. Siwing pointed the spear at Sheen and ordered him to accept his offer, or else the boy would perish, and he immediately began to stammer that he had always respected the hero. She stared at them quietly and silently. The guard grabbed the student by the hair and suggested that the rebel consider a year of studying together and becoming friends. The young man waved his hand and smiled, allowing him to carry out his plan, adding that he would not fall for threats. Xing scowled and was annoyed that this beast did not care about his classmate's life at all, and the red-haired man screamed that they should not slay him because he knew the hero's weak point. The guy switted and mumbled that Guanjin was now inside the prison, and that he was more useful as a captive since he was the brunette's best friend. The other person chuckled, noting that this scoundrel would betray any comrade to save his own skin, which was almost impressive. However, the man blew his head off, saying that he hated scoundrels who betrayed their allies. Blasts were heard in front of the hero. The guard started running, saying that the guy's blood was on Chi's hands. The young man suddenly appeared behind the man, replying that it was nonsense. He delivered a strong strike, throwing the foe up, and said that he himself had slain the young man, but he didn't have to worry because the guy would avenge him. Someone was walking toward the prison. The student caught up with the bespectacled man and said that all their classmates had already fled, and they also needed to retreat because if the trackers from the Special Intelligence Unit found out what was happening in the prison, they would be finished. But Guanian said that he would wait for the hero and he could go first. The other person gritted his teeth and suggested leaving the already mad guy alone. A strong blast was heard. The hero raised his hand and noted that breaking through mental protection 9 times in a row gives this effect, and his turtle casing is healing more and more slowly. The guard opened his eyes. He gritted his teeth, trying to figure out how long he had been unconscious and what the heck this kid had done to him. The guy smirked, noticing that he had woken up, and suggested that he strike with all his strength. The man roared and stood up, mentally outraged that this scoundrel continued to insult him, considering him his plaything. Zhang swung, thinking that the youth had countless chances to finish him off, but he did not. So the path continued to laugh, but he would slay him with one strike. The man froze in front of the calm face of the hero, feeling that he could not move. Tears welled up in his eyes from the realization that the foe was right in front of his nose, but he could not do anything. The overseer shook and asked what he had done to him, and the guy replied that he had done nothing. The hero gripped his opponent's fist and said that he was like a rabbit frozen in front of a hawk, or a sheep in front of a lion, because fear is a natural instinct, and his body resists orders and wants to be as far away from the guy as possible. The other person cried, muttering that he could still fight and would slay him. She raised an eyebrow and noted that he could no longer even strike, so now he would conduct a deeper study of him. He extended his hand and offered to look at where exactly the tracker's mental strength comes from the core of the heart, stomach, or head, and then added that he would be very careful and would not let him die so easily. Xing's eyes widened, and he screamed in terror. Blood gushed from his stomach. The hero stood over him, surprised that he died. Apparently, human life is truly frail. The bespectacled man approached him, and the boy looked back, checking if everyone else had fled. Guanchen looked at him worriedly and exclaimed that his injury was more important now. Blood suddenly spurted. The hero's body suddenly appeared to be covered in many wounds, though he mumbled that he was just overexcited and accidentally used too much force, and a couple of bones broke. But these were all small matters. He collapsed to the ground, saying that he would be fine after a short rest. The martial arts school hall. The blonde girl looked ahead and demanded that he not come any closer. The tracker smiled and said that he simply wanted to meet her teacher, the famous and unmatched Sudol. The other person stood in front of him, relaying the words of the teacher that he did not want to meet strangers, to which the man replied that the talk was related to his adopted son. The blonde looked at him coldly and repeated that her mentor did not want to see outsiders, so let him leave. The tracker spread his arms and laughed loudly, saying that his adopted son had slain the Minister of Foreign Affairs and would soon be executed, and the old man was scared to show his face. He smiled and exclaimed that the former ruler of the Shishan underworld turned out to be a coward, timid as a rat, and this was disappointing. Suddenly, the girl attacked quickly, and the tracker's aide barely managed to shield his master. The guy scowled, noticing the power, but blocked it. The foe struck with her foot. The brunette staggered in surprise, realizing that his mental shield was broken. The girl took out a blade and swung. The boy gripped the hand that was emitting dark power and thought it was too late to stop. The blonde stepped between them, catching her hand and noting that she had a very bad temper if she was going to slay just because she didn't like someone's words. The girl looked at him fiercely and said that anyone who insulted the teacher should perish. The tracker raised his eyebrows and said that her older brother had slain the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and she was attacking officers of the Special Intelligence Unit, so such dangerous people should be dealt with as soon as possible. The girl hit him hard between the legs. The man clenched his teeth and sweated. He let go of her hand and she jumped back. The blonde crouched down, looking at the intruders. The tracker scowled and noted that it was cruel to hit such places, and she had also taken advantage of his shock and slipped out of his hands. So, it was good that he was protected by his mental power. Otherwise, his lower body functions would have already failed, and now he had a reason to slay her. The man looked back, feeling that his mental abilities were blocked, and there were at least 3A rank trackers nearby ready to attack him at any moment. A man with a cigar entered the hall, saying that the guys from the Special Intelligence Unit were quite bold to talk to his little sister like that. Everyone looked at the third disciple of the teacher and the current leader of the Black Snake Society, Shio Roland, and the blonde man asked if his 8A rank trackers were hiding nearby. Shion scowled and asked if he, as a fighter, only used his power to bully others. The other man smirked and replied that strength was like a fist, and the strength of his aides was also his strength. The guy looked at the shadow above him. Roland put his hand on his head and asked if the man didn't think so, and the pale youth asked his superior to save him. The blonde furrowed his brows and asked if he really wanted to make enemies of them. The man put out a cigar on the brunette's forehead and replied that they were not worthy of it, just a stray dog who got lucky and wanted to prey on them. Besides, why did he think that the strength he had luckily gained could be compared to the Black Snake Society's gathered strength for decades at the Mingzin Martial Arts School? Roland pressed the guy's head into the floor with his foot and said that he had been patient until now, but now he should leave. Chien scowled and said that he was here on behalf of the Special Intelligence Unit in the name of maintaining order and fairness, and the martial arts schools should answer for Chi's misdeeds. The other man looked at him coldly and noted that the young boy had gotten carried away and made errors. But at his age, the man had the blood of hundreds of people on his hands. The blonde man grimaced and exclaimed that they couldn't compare, because the young man had slain the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the tracker had good reason to believe that he had worked with the rebels to disrupt the peace talks. The other man lifted his chin and asked if there was any proof since the agreement had been signed anyway. Chien scowled and replied that proof didn't matter. Even the link between Chi and the rebel army didn't matter. But if the man didn't hand over control of the Black Snake Society, the student's life would be in danger, and the Mingzhen Martial Arts School and its teachers would be involved. The warrior took a step forward and noted that the tracker simply wanted the Black Snake Society. He leaned over the blonde and asked what group was backing him, to which he was told that it didn't matter, and that he just needed to talk to his teacher in person. Roland's eyes flashed, and he laughed, repeating the guest's words. She relaxed his brows and asked what was so amusing about needing to talk to his teacher. The other man looked at him fiercely and exclaimed that to beasts and powerful groups, a man was just a cheap disposable tool, so how could a tool negotiate with people? He smiled and told Lung, an A-rank tracker and director of the Special Intelligence Unit, that his head was only worth 50 bits on the black market. The blonde smirked and agreed that he was a cheap scoundrel, but added that the price for Chi's head was much higher. Roland leaned over and said that he would greet his friend when he was freed since he just wanted to have some fun and rest in jail, to which the tracker replied that the guy was in Blackgate Prison. The leader of the Black Snake widened his eyes and asked if he was in his right mind. The blonde smirked and added that the man should understand what was happening in this prison now, so how long could the young man last there? Roland grabbed the man by the chest and exclaimed that if something happened to Chi, even 10 of his deaths would not be enough to cover it. The other person smirked and replied that he was ready for it, but it was time for him and his teacher to choose. So, let him give up the Black Snake Society, and then he would let the hero leave right now. Suddenly, a soldier ran into the gate calling Lung. The two men looked at the commander with alarm, and reported that they had just received a message that all the captives had escaped from the Black Gate prison. The blonde waved his hand and replied that there was no need to panic. These students must have managed to flee with someone's aid. Perhaps this was their chance to gain favor and reveal their link with the rebels or the Black Snake Society. The aide sweeted and said that the students had fled by themselves, and they had also slain the prison guard, and based on the current proof, there was no outside aid. Long's eyes widened. His face was twisted in horror and confusion. 2 soldiers were dragging the injured man after the talk. The blonde followed them. The girl standing next to Roland asked why they didn't just slay them all. The man crossed his arms and replied that it was wrong to take someone's life within the walls of the teacher's martial arts school, and first they had to find out about Lanka and the group that gave him this order. And the blonde mumbled that it was so dull. Roland narrowed his eyes and explained that they should be more cautious and advised the girl to control herself, use her head more, and learn from him. The girl looked up and said that the teacher had specifically instructed her not to learn from him, because the man was a coward, and those who practice martial arts were supposed to show bravery. The man raised his hands in an offended manner, and explained that he was terribly worried about the safety of the school. And did she know how many people were coveting their wealth and chances? To which the girl mumbled that if only the elder brother and second elder sister were still here, no one would dare to encroach on them. Roland covered her mouth with his hand, looking around, and exclaimed that even though the teacher was in the bedroom, he could still hear them. The girl looked at him and said that the teacher had gone out, and had not returned to the school for several days. The other person sweated and asked never to mention these traitors in front of the teacher in the future, because every time he gets angry he starts beating him or she. The blonde turned around and decided that she should go with the weak hero, otherwise if he dies the teacher will be upset. Roland closed his eyes and asked not to create more trouble, and he himself will look for the guy, hoping that he will stay alive and will not cause trouble anymore, and then added that for some reason, there is not a single person in the school for whom you do not have to worry. The hero recalled himself in childhood when he was asked what he was looking at, and the young man answered with a smile that these were Taoist scrolls about rebirth, which said that this curious method is practiced only after death. Yuan walked up to him leaving behind the defeated foes, and asked if this was the martial arts method they found in the Red Lotus group, adding that if it worked, the cultists they beat up would have risen to fight them again. She furrowed his brows and exclaimed that he should have figured it out himself, but he was almost fooled. The blonde man smiled and pointed out that he was only confused because he craved martial arts methods too much, and must have traded the points he earned from defeating the Red Lotus group members for martial arts. The hero furrowed his brows and replied that they were really too greedy in the courtyard, and after eliminating so many Red Lotus cultists, he could only trade 3 average second-rate methods, because the number of points needed to obtain superior martial arts was enormous. The other person looked at him and said that the court allowed the trade of methods, which guarantees their authenticity, the absence of mistakes, and missing details in the texts, and they even provide special teachers for explanation and guidance. This is an incredibly rare allowance from the imperial court, and the brunette asked if this had not happened in the past. Yuan gestured with his hand and replied that the imperial army had many fighters, and with the military setups, they were far superior to other martial arts groups on the battlefield, and in the past, when the cultists were pushing the refugees to rebel, the imperial army could easily deal with them. But this situation was different, and the imperial court hired martial arts groups, even masters without group affiliation like the 2 of them, to deal with the Red Lotus cultists. Yet the imperial army did almost nothing, which was very odd. The hero looked away and mumbled that this was all too complex, and as long as he could gain martial arts and become stronger, he would continue to be happy. Several people were nearing them. Yuan narrowed his eyes and noticed that someone was coming. The hero smiled, guessing that they were more Red Lotus cultists who he could earn more points from. The friend looked back and said that they were just refugees who had been charmed by the group, and they had never practiced martial arts, so there would be no points for slaying them. The weary people approached, lamenting that the envoys were dead because of them. She shrugged and said that the foolish humans should thank him for saving them from the hands of the Red Lotus, and now they could go home. The men looked at him with displeasure and said that they did not understand anything because ruin was coming, and only the Red Lotus group could protect and feed them, and they did not need their rescue. The hero smirked and said that he did not need permission to rescue them because as a strong man he could do whatever he wanted. The man on the ground suddenly trembled. The thin man pointed his finger at him. The corpse rose with red eyes, and the refugees said that they should be wary of those scoundrels who insulted the Red Lotus, not him. Suddenly, the one who had risen from the dead jumped up quickly and chopped off their heads. He prepared to attack the young men standing in front of them. The hero grinned eagerly and exclaimed that this was not a trick, and the deceased Red Lotus cultist really came back to life, which means that the Taoist scrolls of rebirth and the cultivation method that can only be practiced after death are real.